Welcome, everyone. I'm Cheryl Pop. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for what promises to be a very animated conversation with four authors who have written about women in World War II. I am broadcasting live from Sausalito Books by the Bay, our waterfront location here in Sausalito. Two of our guests are joining us from the Pacific Northwest. Another one is in the Central Valley, and one of them is right up the hill from me here in Sausalito. And while I wish you could all be with us under one roof, the authors and our guests, even in the best of times, that might have been difficult to orchestrate due to geography. So in that sense, how wonderful that we can all have this virtual experience together. Tonight, we are going to be discussing women who served in World War II, many of whom were unsung heroines, their contributions, their fortitude, their resilience, their bravery. And joining me for this conversation are four very exceptional New York Times bestselling authors who have researched and written extensively about just such women. So before I introduce our special guests, I want to go into a little bit of a little Zoom protocol. You can see us, we can't see you. And we also can't hear you, and the dog's barking and the doorbell ringing and the phone's going off. So that's intentional. But that doesn't mean you're not going to have an opportunity to interact with us. At the bottom of your screen, at any time, you can submit a question in the Q&A box or the chat box. And at the end of our conversation, you will have an opportunity to ask all of our authors a question. Since there are four of them, please indicate if it's a question for all of them or one specifically. So that's about it. I'm going to introduce each of our authors, and then we are going to launch into our discussion. We are so honored. And I've had so much fun talking to these ladies before we started. I really wish they were all here and we could go out for a drink afterwards, but next time. Anyway, I'm very honored to have author Kristin Hanna with us this evening. Kristin is an award-winning best-selling author of more than 20 books, including The Nightingale. Many of you have no doubt read this remarkable book, which is set in German-occupied France during World War II. It is a gripping tale of two sisters and the French resistance. You're going to hear more about it. The Nightingale has won many awards, including Goodreads Best Historical Fiction Novel for 2015, People's Choice Award for Best Fiction that same year, and it is now being made into a film, a Hollywood film by TriStar, to be released late next year. It's being directed by award-winning director Melanie Laurent, with the cast led by Dakota and Ellie Fanning. So this is very exciting indeed. Kristin, congratulations. Hopefully there will be time to hear about Kristin's other historical novels, including The Great Alone, which was voted Best Historical Novel of the Year in 2018 by Goodreads, and her highly anticipated new book, The Four Winds, which I have just about finished reading, and it is it's gripping. It's going to be published by St. Martin's Press in February next year, and it's also a blockbuster. It is also my great pleasure to introduce Ciji Ware, Sausalito's own Ciji Ware. She is the author of 12 works of historical and contemporary fiction, 2 nonfiction books. She's been shortlisted for the Willa Cather Literary Award in 2012. She's an Emmy Award-winning former broadcaster and recipient of Harvard University's prestigious Alumni Award. Her World War II novel, which is the most recent book she's published. Oh, I should have held up the books. Here's The Nightingale.
Beautiful cover.
Here's Landing by Moonlight. That's her most recent book, and you're going to hear more about it later in this program, and hopefully also about her new book, which is also set in World War II. We did the launch for this book at my Do Bookstore about a year ago, and we had no power and there were raging wildfires. Welcome to my world. What a year to launch a new business. And then we had a pandemic. Anyway, at her book launch, I just have to share this little anecdote. Everyone came in World War II costume. I looked like a parachutist. She had the Boogie Woogie Bugle Girls, truly a singing trio, and we did it all in the dark. It was like the Blitzkrieg in London. It could not have been more appropriate. So anyway, that's her most recent book, which you're going to hear about. Also joining us from the Pacific Northwest is author Jill Barnett. Jill started writing her first novel when she started a family many years ago. And as a result, there are over 8 million Jill Barnett books in print today. Her work has been published in 23 languages, and she has won dozens of prestigious awards, including the Percy Award for Literature. She was a finalist for Favorite Book of the Year with Romance Writers of America, was nominated 6 times for their prestigious Rita Award. Jill was also the first historical romance author to receive a starred review in Publishers Weekly, which is a really big deal, I will tell you. Her work has often made Best Book of the Year, national bestseller lists, the New York Times, USA Today, the Washington Post. The accolades go on. Almost 20 years ago, she turned her hand and pen to writing a World War II historical novel called Sentimental Journey. And I don't have the most recent, I don't have
It's okay.
I don't have the cover she likes best. I like the other cover. I like the other cover better too, Jill. Anyway, but I will tell you, I just finished reading this book and I could not put it down. It's really, it may have been penned 20 years ago, but it's very timeless literature. And I think it too could be a movie. So it's a really riveting read, but you're going to hear more about that as well. And finally, I'm also delighted to introduce the equally prolific writer, Kim Ostrom. Kim has a great story. When she was in 3rd grade, she informed her teacher that she did not want to learn the multiplication tables, which sounded like me. I hated math. She was going to be a writer when she grew up. And guess what? She did. She sold her first historical romance and embarked on a 35-year career as an author. Her 33 best-selling award-winning novels, she's written that many, and if you do the math, that's almost one a year, have been translated into numerous languages. And in case you get confused, she has several nom de plumes, which I love. She publishes under the name Kimberly Cates, as well as Elsa March Chase. She has just written, yet to be published, a novel set during World War II as well, with the working title of The Gold in Broken Places. And it deals with the aftermath of Pearl Harbor and the Japanese internment camps. So thank you all for joining us. I'm so honored to have all of you. It's just a formidable forum. So women have figured prominently as figures in literature written about wars for centuries, from the Russian and French Revolution to the Civil War and the Vietnam War. But it's really only in recent years that their remarkable, mostly unsung contributions during World War II have been recognized and written about. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening. You've all written about American women in World War II. Kristin has written about French women in World War II. So we are going to start with you, Kristin, and all of our authors are going to answer sort of the basically same questions, but tell us what sort of woman you wrote about in your World War II novel, The Nightingale. Tell our listeners, viewers who may not be familiar with it, a little bit about the book and what inspired you.
Okay, well, let's see. I'll start with, it's about 2 French sisters living, as you mentioned, in Nazi-occupied France. And it's sort of how both of them find the courage to do what they want to do during the war and the price they pay for that courage. In terms of what inspired me, it was interesting. I wrote a World War II book a couple of years before The Nightingale, a book called Winter Garden, which was set during World War II in Leningrad. And that was sort of my first foray in years, moving from contemporary women's fiction into historical fiction. And as I was doing the research for, the Russian book, I came across the story of a woman named Andrée Dujon, who was a 19-year-old Belgian girl. And she and her father started one of the first escape routes out of France during the war. And as I read her story and read, the price that she and her father paid and how they did it, the walking over the Pyrenees in, espadrilles and the price that they paid to do this, I thought to myself, I cannot believe I don't know this story. I'm well read. I know a lot about World War II and about history, and I don't know the story of these French women, and I should, because they were rock stars. And so I thought to myself, somebody really needs to write this book because this is just a great story. So I waited for somebody else to write this book because the last thing I wanted to take on was France and World War II. That was just such a daunting task, because I'm not a historian, and I knew that it would be more expansive and more difficult research than I had ever tackled. And so I just waited for someone else to do it. And but as I was waiting, I was researching more and more and more. And finally, after about 2 years, I thought, this story is not only gripping, it's important. And I'm aging fast, and somebody may not write it. And so I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to dive in and sort of pretend that I have the skill set to do this, and hope that my skill set would rise enough to make the book workable. And I would say I loved it, by the way, from the get-go. It required, sadly, a trip to France to do some research because, I had to. And I really just fell in love with France. I fell in love with everything about it. And I think I was about 6 or 8 months into the project, and I began to get a glimmer that it was a special story, and that maybe I could pull this off, but that it would be a function of time, that I couldn't pull it off in the amount of time I had, because at that point I was writing a book a year. And so I called my editor and I said, I think I have a chance here to write something that will be the best thing I've done to date, but I need another 18 months to do it. And I am incredibly grateful that my team, Kim and I have the same agency, and that they supported me and said, okay, take the time, write the book. And it did. It changed my life. It changed my career, and I learned a great deal about writing from that book.
I want to get back to what you learned about writing, but before that, I want to hear from Jill. Can you?
Oh, me. Okay. What was the question? What led me to write the book?
A little bit about the book and what inspired you.
Well, the book is a story of, there are 5 characters, actually 6. There's a German soldier also with has and there are a lot of pilots in the book, but my father was in the Army Air Corps. And so I grew up watching World War II movies, John Wayne movies, all of the World War II things. And yeah, I've always loved it. I've always loved the history. I love anything that's history. I love that. I'm a big history buff, which is why I write historical fiction, and historical romance too. And so I had the opportunity to change the kind of books I was writing from my publisher. And my editor said, do you want to write what you've been writing, or do you want to write something else? And I said, I want to write something else. And I went for World War II because it was my love and because of my dad. There's a character in the book. His name is Red Walker, and he's from a little farm in Texas. And that's my dad. It's based on my dad. And then as I was researching, I found out about these wonderful women pilots. And so one of the main characters in the book is a female pilot. And I found the history of these women pilots fascinating. And then there is J.R. Cassidy, and he is one of the first Army Rangers. They originally created this group of of Rangers in just prior or right in the first part of World War II. And they trained him in Scotland. And so he is one of the first Rangers, and he is sent on a mission to, oh my God, there you go. He is sent on a mission to rescue a scientist's daughter who they're afraid has been taken by the Nazis in North Africa. And she is also a character. These women are strong women, and she has her own strengths. And I don't want to say why she has strengths, but there are things that you learn about her that make her life very, very difficult. And so, and that's Kitty Kincaid. And then there is the RAF soldier, pilot named Skip. And he gets involved with one of the characters. And so they all intertwine together. And the book takes place, it goes all over the place. It goes from New Mexico to Rhode Island to England to Morocco to the Sahara Desert to back to England. I think somewhere else too, but I can't really remember. It goes all over with these fighters in the war, and it takes in the whole war.
And one of the female protagonists is a barnstormer. She's one of these pilots who is truly exceptional, truly exceptional. And again, I don't want to say too much and ruin the story for people because it's so riveting.
Well,
I
didn't know if you wanted me to talk about the research here or not, because
we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it
because I didn't want to go where she came from and what she did until we went there.
Yeah. We'll get back to that. Ciji, tell us about your female heroines, your World War II novel, and what inspired you.
Well, it's funny. I now realize I'm writing this sort of a trilogy, and I ended up after the fact calling it the American Spy Sisters series, which is really World War II historical thriller based on the lives of the American women secret agents who volunteered for the British in their intelligence service and ended up mostly getting parachuted back behind enemy lines or coming in on felucca boats and landing secretly in the middle of the night. And I got drawn into this, and I think I'd already read Nightingale, Kristin, because it was so wonderful. And I thought, well, I couldn't even try to do that. She wrote that fabulous book. But every summer for years and years, my husband and my father-in-law, who was in World War II, we all kind of have these fun links, went back to France and to a part in France in the Alps called Ware on Lake Annecy. And we would go every summer. They had a very modest foundation. They raised money to bring American kids to come learn French because my father-in-law was so horrified by the war. And he wanted, he was there for the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco, and he wanted to do something to raise the awareness of American kids, of France and what they've been through. So anyway, we would go every summer, and these kids would come over, mostly from Tufts University, and learn French and be in French families. And we would walk through the little village of Talwar, looking at these statues, never reading any of them. Well, it turned out they were all odes and statues to French resistant fighters, because the Alps had its own version of the resistance. They were guerrilla fighters to begin with. So at one point, knowing none of this, ignoring the statues, ignoring the plaques, never even looking, even though I was writing historical novels, a French friend said, have you ever been to the French Resistance Museum? Well, we went to this little sort of, it's really like a hut, a chalet, which was a handmade museum with pictures literally thumbtacked on the walls of local resistance leaders. And outside the chalet was a saddest graveyard of 118 French resistance fighters who were wiped out by the Germans very near where I had been going for 20 years. And on the wall were these several pictures of women. And one was a Brit, one was an American, and one was named Odette Sampson Churchill. And I went, my gosh. So when I got home, I started nosing around, well, who were the other women, not the French women in the resistance, but those Brits and probably Belgian. And it turned out there were 3 American women who had joined the SOE for a variety of reasons. So anyway, I tracked them down, and my first two books are based on their lives. They're not, I changed the names and I didn't want to be sort of tied to their exact stories, but they were extraordinary because they had to speak French. They had to pass for French. My French is not good enough. I could never pass for French. They had to go through boot camp in Scotland, like you all realize, where they learned silent killing, how to stuff plastique into dead rats and blow up bridges, and all the same skills that the men had to acquire, plus parachute school, jumping out of an airplane, you know, and not killing yourself and landing behind enemy lines and getting into town and assuming a cover story. And there are these three Americans, and they each had their own bizarre, extraordinary reasons for wanting to join the British to fight the Nazis. And each one of them was just, you know, they were there. The book was there. I mean, you just had to write it. And so in the end, they were out of 470 secret agents in this. So it was called the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. It was kind of a stepchild of MI5, MI6, and they had big fights between them, you know, in London. But anyway, there were 470 agents, and there were 39 female agents between the ages of 25 and 53. 39 were women, and they were dubbed Churchill's Angels. And the three Americans, well, 25 survived the war, 12 were executed by the Nazis. One died in a ship that was sunk trying to get to France, and one died of natural causes. But the great thing was all three Americans survived. And the only other American I found so far was the African-American singer, entertainer, Josephine Baker. But she worked for the Free French, straight for the de Gaulle group, not for the British side. So I haven't done her, and I think there is a novel about her somewhere. But so I've got these three unknown women, and they were totally unsung, and no one knew who the heck they were until the archives were opened after 1995 on the 50th anniversary of World War II, because they'd all signed the Secrets Act. And so nothing about them or what they did. And it was illegal to have women in combat roles anyway. So Churchill completely, you know, ignored that. But it was such a rich treasure trove of just those Americans, and that's what interested me.
Thank you, Ciji. Kim, you have just finished writing your World War II novel. Tell us a little bit about your women in war, your heroine, and what did you learn that you maybe weren't previously aware of about women in World War II? And your book is also more in the Pacific theater versus in Europe. So a little bit of a different slant, perhaps.
Mine takes place in America and is set in the San Francisco, Berkeley area. I'm a Midwestern girl, and I'm the granddaughter of a surgeon who was in the Pacific theater. And one of our prized possessions is his dollar bill that he wrote all of the battles that he had been in, or, you know, his ships had been in. And it was so interesting, though. I was not aware as a Midwestern girl about the Japanese internment camps. It just, and like Kristin, I was like, how can I not know this? How did this totally, you know, how did I totally miss this? I love history. I read history. I'd read a lot about World War II, but I had never stumbled across this. I was lured to this story by a picture, a photograph. I was watching PBS and American Experience about Dorothea Lange. And part of that was that she took photographs of the process, not only of Kristin's amazing Dust Bowl pictures that she took that changed our perception of the people who were caught in that tragedy, but she also was hired by the government to take photographs of the process of the internment camps from beginning to end. And she took the job hoping that she could change people's minds and hearts and help them to see that these were Americans, citizens. 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned during the war. Most of them were American citizens. and you only needed 1/16 of drops of I'm sorry, 1/16 ancestry of Japanese ancestry to be interred. So I was just blown away by that. And I started reading. I was so haunted by the photographs. And what I discovered was that people were given just mere days to gather their things and put their affairs in order, and then they were shipped out to places they didn't know where they were going. They had no idea. And so imagine taking your family and putting them on a bus and having no idea where you were going. You could only take what you could carry. And I loved the fact that there was so much resilience in this community. And so there were things that I didn't realize. My book is a triangle of friends. A Caucasian man, college student, a Japanese American college student, and a young woman. And it's a love story, but it's also a story about friendship and people who defended each other during this time. As I was studying, I found out about an actual photographer named Toyo Mitaki, who smuggled a camera into Manzanar internment camp because it was against the law to take photographs. Even Dorothea's photographs were impounded, so no one would see them. And so there was a man who smuggled in a camera and was able to take photographs. And so that's what my story is about. This young man who I have kind of doing the same thing. It's a question of what do we do when we see great injustice? Do we look away or do we act?
Well, I look forward to reading that, Kim, and hopefully it'll be out next year. You've all talked a little bit about the importance of research, because these books were all written about times when none of us were alive. And obviously the 50th anniversary of the war in 1995, as Ciji said, opened up these archives. Were those the most significant source of information for you? Or I know, Jill, you talked about it was family experience. Do you want to talk about that? And then maybe
Well, I actually
get
went
the
to
rest.
museums all across the United States, flight museums, and bought books there because there was so much coming out at the time, and there was a lot about women. And my female flyer, it was fascinating to learn. There were a lot of women pilots that had been barnstormers like Charlie was, and they didn't have a lot of male pilots. And so when the Army Air Corps, which was the original Air Force, started in Texas, in Southern Texas, they hired women to teach the men how to fly, which I think that's just wonderful. And so the women were hired. They couldn't fight in the war. Eventually, some of them did in the Pacific, but they couldn't fight in the war, but they could teach the men to fly. But then there was a group of women that were headed by, and she's a very famous pilot. Her name is Nancy Love. And she decided early on, actually before the US was in the war, to take a group of women over to England. And these women were ferrying pilots. And you might have heard about that because there's been a lot that's come out about it in probably the last 10 years. And what these women did was they flew the planes from the factories to the airfields where the men would then take the planes out and fly them in the war. And the interesting thing, which I found just fascinating, is that a plane could crash and they would pick up the parts and take the parts to the factory. And the next day, a woman was flying that plane to one of the RAF
Mm,
bases. That's how quickly they could rebuild these planes. And they, you know, they were like tin cans. I wouldn't want to necessarily be in one, but they would fly back.
mm,
That I found fascinating. And so she ends up in England. All the characters end up in England. They all end up friends. They all meet under different circumstances that carry the war. But finding all these women's histories was just fascinating to me. And they actually came out of the flight museums in places
mm,
in New England and
mhm.
in New Mexico and some other places. And so those books I found so interesting. In fact, there was one that has always haunted me. I think I kept the book, and it was about actual fighter pilots that were women, and they were in the Polish Air Force. There was a whole group of women who were female Polish pilots who actually fought the Nazis.
I think one of the most compelling things about the three novels that I've read that you have written, the three of you have written, is the accuracy of whether I mean, Jill's book, the way she talks about the planes crashing and the pilots and the experience, it is so believable. And Ciji writing about the women parachuting and going behind foreign lines. And Kristin, let me ask you this, because you probably were relying more on French history versus American history. So tell us about your research process and how it may have been different.
Well, it was interesting. So when I began this book, and I'm trying to think, I think it came out in 2015. Does that sound right?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right.
And so I probably started 2014. So I probably started writing it in like 2011. And the truth is that it was at that time extremely difficult to find any information on any primary source information on the French resistance. And very, very quickly, you know, once I sort of got into this, there was a fabulous book that if people who love World War II haven't read, they should, called Sarah's Key, that came out in this time period. And Sarah's Key really kind of blew the doors off what the French had been trying so hard to hide. And like Ciji was saying, you know, you would walk through Parisian streets or whatever streets, and there would be little tiny plaques of resistance things all the way along, but nothing was really calling attention to it. And one of the things I noticed on my trip over there was I would go to a lot of museums. And my husband loved to point out, we would start with, like, you know, Roman times or whatever, and we're looking at plows, we're looking at dirt, we're looking at all this and going from room to room. And one of them that I remember most specifically went from 1931, after going like with every single moment through time, from 1931 to 1951. There wasn't even an exhibit about World War II.
Wow.
And so, but as I began researching, it sort of broke through, and I was able to find, with regard to my character Isabel, who is like Ciji's, you know, essentially becomes a spy. There are a lot of female World War II spy memoirs, whether it's Nancy Wake or, you know, whoever. And then you just sort of imagine them being French. What was impossible to research was the women who hid the Jewish children. It was just an incredibly difficult topic to find things on. And so it was like this constant search to find the sort of the trappings of that. And a lot of it ended up being, you know, a few of the great scenes in the book are from research, but a lot of that was also me just imagining, what does it feel like when you're risking your life in this way? And, you know, you sort of, you do the research that you can. And then our job is to take all of that research, to synthesize it, to humanize it, and to turn it into acts and characters that that sweep people away and give them both information and emotion at the same time.
It's interesting. I had very similar experience. Luckily for me, I got interested, about 20 years after, oh, it's okay. 20 years after they opened the archives. And the three women had all either written a biography, an autobiography, which was like a gold mine, or they had a biography written about them very recently. I mean, literally, I'd started the book, and in that same year, I started to write about one of the character that's in Moonlight. I had enough kind of a sketch about her. She had stolen the French naval codes out of the French embassy safe in Washington, D.C. by compromising the public relations guy in the French embassy and getting him to get her in the embassy so they could steal the codes. And those codes ended up being used to conquer North Africa. And because they could conquer North Africa, they could get the troops, and the Allied troops could get to Sicily and up Italy and eventually invade France from the south. So she was a key person. And only in like 2018, while I was in the middle of it, her biography came out. But when we were in Terroir, where so much of this happens in the Alps, we would have dinner at a restaurant that we've been going to for 20 years. And finally, I started asking the owner, well, where were you in the world? And he said, in Terroir, population 500 people, I don't speak to half the people in this village because they were collaborators. And he said, everyone claims they were in the resistance. And he started talking to me about the factions. And you ask, what didn't you know? What I didn't realize that there was not one monolithic French resistance. I know Kristin learned that. There were the communists, there were the sort of pro-anti-Semites, there were the, guerrilla fighters who were, I mean, there was no monolithic French resistance. And that even in a town as small as 500 people, there, some people looked away, some people fought to hide kids and hide people trying to get away. And this town was very near the Swiss border. So it became one of the escape routes, Kristin, that, you instead of going over the Pyrenees, you had to go over the Alps to get into Switzerland. And there was an escape route that had been established from Lyon to Terroir and Annecy, and then into Switzerland. So the thing that, once you start following that little thread, and it leads to something else, and that pictures on the wall of the museum got me interested in the women, which got me interested in the local women, which got me interested, were there any Americans? And it's just sort of like following crumbs, really. And I did the same thing. I read the biographies. I read a lot of secondary sources. I didn't, on this one, read a lot of primary. I've done that. But then I just said, okay, what's the story? Why do I care about these women, Americans? What in the hell were they doing in France, working for the British, trying to help get rid of the Nazis? And that, answering those questions just leads you to what it is you're writing about, which was bravery, and also driven by some quirky stuff about why they had been in France. One of them, their father had been selling equipment to the Nazis, and she had seen the rise of Hitler as a little girl and hated it, and vowed as soon as the Nazis invaded France that she would fight. So to find those motivations in whatever research and materials available, that's the trick.
Well, and I think to that point, the fact it's great that you can have all the research in the world, but you need to be able to put it together in a really compelling fashion and weave a story. And I want to give Kim an opportunity to talk about the research issue, but then I want to come back to what Kristin said about what she learned about writing this. And because it's, the research is critical, and it's great that there's so much of it. And you do have to have sort of a journalist nose of some sort to find it, but then you have to put it all together. So Kim, do you want to talk about research a little bit and your
Sure.
experience with that? And then we'll move on to sort of this, how you put it all together.
Sure. I love the research for me. There were so many photographs that I leafed through. Those were the ones that absolutely fascinated me as I looked through Dorothea Lange's photographs of her impounded photographs, which were released in the 1960s. These photographs that had been buried. And the reason they had been buried was because she took the step to absolutely show that these were American families in their farms with their shops, with, closing down family businesses. And you have pictures of children with their dogs saying goodbye to their family pets. Um, and kids saying the Pledge of Allegiance, kids who were Boy Scouts, and for me, that was the thing that really struck me. What was it like to be a college student at that time at Berkeley? And one minute you're going to bonfires on the beaches and just doing American things. You've been playing baseball your whole life. And then suddenly you're an enemy alien and you are an outsider and you're being sent away. Those photographs haunted me. Pictures of a young mother in line getting ready to register, and she's straining to see ahead of her, and you can see the fear in her face, and yet the trust in her government as well. She's an American citizen. This can't possibly be as bad as it seems. And that was the thing that truly haunted me. And as I dug deeper, the resilience of the people who made home in the camps and and those people who actually helped them preserve whatever was beyond the gates. And I felt as if I was looking through this wonderful lens of humanity. It was like the best and the worst, the suspicions, and now the research was amazing. And when I saw the resilience and the inventiveness of Toyo, who made this camera out of a smuggled lens that he had took into the camps, and so that he was actually taking pictures that could later be released. It was amazing.
Kim, it just strikes me so much that the story about, Americans who were Asian and were discriminated against, it just rings so contemporarily that I think you got a great subject.
That was what really appealed to me. But the thing that stunned me, somebody with 1/16 Japanese blood. There were people who were interned that didn't realize until the war that they had a Japanese great grandmother or grandmother. And the shock of that suddenly being the other, it's just crazy, and so heartbreaking, and the choices made. And so that was what fascinated me about this book.
Many of them never recovered. My brother,
No.
his father was interned. His family was interned in Southern California, and his father never got over it.
No, how
It
can
was
you?
confiscated. Everything they had.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was.
When they read,
And there's so many weird stories. My niece works for, she's a master gardener, and she was helping a Japanese family turn their strawberry business into organic about 4 years ago. And it turned out the old Japanese lady that was on the farm was almost 100 years old. And she and her whole family, the Otos, had been interned from Sacramento. They were sent down to Santa Anita Racetrack, which had been one of the gathering spots. And the Caucasian neighbors kept the land for them and kept the farm going the entire war and handed them back the deed at the end. So there was everything in the spectrum of what happened. People who behaved horribly, and then people like the Odo's family friends who preserved their hand. I mean, it is such a rich thing to mine.
Well, and personal stories seem to be the ones that really resonate. I know some of the things in my book came from actual
right.
stories. closest friend's husband was German, and he was alive during the war. And they had a friend, and she was a child who was half Jewish, and she was hidden in an attic for quite a few years before they were able to get her out. And so you find these personal stories, and they just, you have to use them. You have to find a way to bring them
Mm. Well, and I think it's so important that authors do that, because there's something to be learned from all of this, which obviously we maybe haven't learned as much as we should based on the current social unrest and injustice. But I think it's so important that these stories are told. And thank you all for doing that, because it is a reminder of, you know, the heartbreaking, the heartwarming, the gut-wrenching, all these stories. There can be a lot of translation into today's world and lessons to be learned about tyrannies to avoid, and taking care of others, and discrimination, and
patriotism.
patriotism.
Amazing,
And what is a real
amazing
patriot?
patriotism.
You know, what is real patriotism?
Yeah.
Thinking about the other guy.
Yeah. Kristin, let's go back to what you said early on about what you learned about writing in doing The Nightingale, and maybe how it's influenced your future writing.
You know, it's hard to quantify. For me, you know, I had written many books by then. I'm going to say 20, but I don't really know. I wrote, you know, like 5 or 6 historical romances, and then I went into what, I don't know what they now call it, women's fiction, for like 10 years. So I knew how to write. I knew how to put a story together. I knew how to create characters. I knew that my strength was eliciting emotion. But what I wanted to do with The Nightingale, once I, you know, it's basically what we're talking about, because you gather this research and you look at these stories and you understand instantly the power of them and the importance of them. And the fact that if you decide to take on the story of, you know, Japanese internment, or whatever it is you take on that is so pivotal, that impacted people's lives to a point that they still don't talk about it, the onus that you feel to do that well, or at least that I felt to do that well, was frightening. And so I didn't know, I knew I could write a good story. What I wanted to do was write to the next level. I wanted to write a historical novel, which I had never really attempted to do before. And I guess what I can say, what I learned was that for me, in the way I work with my process, I can write a really good historical draft that takes into account all of the history and has the timeline correct and the facts correct, and everything is on the chessboard where it's supposed to be. But I can't do that and write a great plot and great characters at the same time. And so what I had to do with The Nightingale, and I ended up having to do it again with The Four Winds, so maybe it's my new process. I essentially have to write a historical novel with almost cardboard characters. I mean, with people that don't live and breathe and feel and react. And then when that novel is in place, then I tear it apart and I bring the people in. And I guess that's what I learned was that, you know, we've all read, you read historical novels all the time that are history rich and character and plot poor. And I came from genre, so I wasn't going to do that if there was any way that I could help it. So I knew how to do the characters. I had to up my historical game. And I also had to at least work very hard at upping my game sentence by sentence, because the book had to be elevated on all, you know, levels. And that's why I now write a book every 3 years instead of every year, because I just simply It's Jill will tell you, it's not like I don't write a book in a year. I write a lot. I write all
He
these
writes
books,
5.
In
I write
2 years.
3.
but I can't write a book that does everything that I want to do in a year.
Mhm.
And and that's maybe of all the things I learned, maybe it's that, maybe that, you know, in genre, we are taught or we're told to work fast. You know, they want us to write quickly. They want us to hit all the notes. They don't want the book to be too different. You know, there's all of these constraints, you know, and that if they're not true, of course, but you know, that sort of is how you feel. And so for me, the moment that I decided time is mine, I can take as long as I want to do this, that's when I think I finally was able to write a book like Nightingale, you know.
Yeah.
So does that make sense?
Well, yeah, it makes sense. And I think you should keep doing it. It's working.
It is working.
It's
The
working.
The
Yeah.
interesting thing was when Kristin, we met, Kristin, Ciji and I met in San Francisco when she was on a book tour for Nightingale. And I was telling her that I had this book that I was working on, and she said, you know, just take your time. She told me her story, and this book has taken me 3 years.
And I want to say, I was at that same lunch, and I don't know if you remember, Kristin, but I thought, oh gosh, I want to tell her I'm working on a World War II book, not to get your permission, but I was sort of scared that I was, because this was upping my game also, the Landing by Moonlight. And you said, go for it. The Americans, go for it. You know, hadn't heard anybody writing about the American women spies, you know, and it was so wonderful. You know, I went back and I thought, yeah, and it's so interesting. I come from a reporting background. You know, I was a broadcaster and a reporter for 18 years before I started writing fiction. And those skills, what I learned was that, man, those skills of who, what, where, why, when, to get the historical part down. And I had the exact same experience. I realized on this kind of work, and everyone's different. Some people are seat of the pants writers. They sit down, they start writing, they never know where it's going to go. Not me, you know, I need to kind of have an outline. I write the historical part, and then I'm a draft writer. And there's a great book called Bird by Bird. It's a writing book, if anybody's interested.
Annie Lamott.
Annie Lamott.
Annie Lamott, and everyone knows the chapter, shitty first drafts, pardon my French. But, you know, I do a really bad first draft because I have to get it down. And it's very much, and then it's adding and weaving and remembering and thinking and being who, what, where, why, when, and, you know, adding all the color and the emotion and the feeling. You know, I'm the same way. I can't do it in a year anymore, you know.
I can't, you know, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kristin.
Well, I'm going to talk about you, so you can just wait a second.
Oh God, I'm scared. We've known each other too long.
All of us.
Jill was like the first one I knew to take on World War II. I'm trying to think. I don't know. This is the cover I have too, unfortunately, and I can't remember the date of this, Jill. But I remember, you know, I was doing women's fiction at the time, and Jill, you know, started writing this World War II book well before
Anybody.
the current, you know, in vogue that World War II is. And
That's
I
right.
remember reading it and just being, you know, sort of blown away by the research and going, yeah, I'm not doing that, you know.
I love the research, man. The writing is the hard part.
You know, seriously. And so I do find it as a writer and as a woman, I find this idea that at the moment historical fiction is in fact dominated by stories of female courage, female empowerment, female history. You know, one of the things about the Four Winds is, and one of my thoughts with Nightingale was, we have to put women back in the forefront of our own history. If you read these books, and like, you know, like Kim, you're saying you didn't know about internment. I knew nothing about the Dust Bowl. You know, we don't know our own stories because women weren't writing them.
Mhm.
Well,
I think it's fascinating and just wonderful that we're doing that now.
It's so
Yeah.
true. And, you know, it's interesting. I think every book I've ever written has asked the question, what were the women doing? And I have written about, you know, professional women playwrights. I remember I wrote a book called Wicked Company that sold zero. And I think it's one of my better books. Anyway, it was about women playwrights whose plays were produced at Covent Garden and Drury Lane in the 18th century. Now, I went to college, I studied literature. I never heard about these women produced playwrights. And when I got into the research, I found out there were 100 produced women playwrights between 1660 and 1820. And the reason we don't know about them is at the end of every century, it would be the men who were doing the sum ups of the century, of the anthologies. And they never included the women plays, even though they were hugely successful. And that was like my second book. And that became my mission, you know, what were the women doing? And I felt that same need of, we got to write these stories because the women were there. And you know, I've written about women playwrights. I've written about women artists. I've written about a woman architect in the early 20th century. They're there. And we have a lot of work to do.
You know, you were talking about what you had learned. And I wrote about 5 main characters, and I had never done that before. Now, I took a couple of years to write the book also. But I had to give them equal balance, which I had, you know, this is not something, you know, juggling all these characters and the entire world and the entire world, something that was not easy. And like Kim said, and I think Ciji and I think even Kristin commented on it too, behind you is this little person who's saying, you better get it right because people remember. You better get it right. You better get it right.
Don't mess up.
It was so important because mine came out when they were still celebrating the greatest generation. And that was who these people were about. And I think that was very daunting for me and why it took me a long time to write it. But you do learn when you're balancing 5 characters and 5 people all over the world. It really tests your skills and it really tests how you bring the emotion and the drama and the meaning and the value to these stories. And then you have to bring them all together, which was quite fun too. So,
well, you know, Kim and I have struggled with, you know, if you wrote a genre, which we all did in the early days, breaking out of that, breaking some bad habits maybe, or some, you know, some quirks that are expected in certain genre writing. And that's what I learned, that you just had to just write the story and write in multiple points of view instead of just the heroine, you know. That really pushed me as a writer of realizing that don't fall into the ticks, you know, don't fall back into the things that we sort of did for a couple of books. And it was freeing to say, you know, as long as you can pay the light bill, that I'm going to take the time and I'm going to try to get this as best it can be, you know.
I'm a child of the 60s, so don't tell me what to do because I won't do it. I don't follow.
You're good about that.
I follow my rules because they're my stories.
But, you know, there's a
Me,
feeling
it was
of
just pushing myself, really
Yeah.
pushing myself.
there's a feeling of responsibility as I was writing this book. There's this huge feeling of responsibility. I'm telling this story that hasn't been told in this way, and I'm talking about the risks that people are taking to stand up and speak out and say, you know, do the right thing, and the price that they paid, which is what you have all done too. They're huge costs to stepping up in history. And I think that that's something we've all felt, and that feeling, like you say, you have to get this right.
But you know, you just, when you do, and you have that story and you show this character who is this person that is so real, and you see what they did, it's so, in a way, something we're missing now. You just believe in the human spirit again. It's just so strong.
Mhm.
Well-
I want to applaud. I want to have time for Q&A, and I want to applaud all of you. You've talked a lot about sort of, first of all, you have all empowered each other. I don't know, for our listeners, viewers' benefit, they are critique partners. They've known each other for decades, these women that you see here, and they've supported each other. I think it's a tribute to your camaraderie and the support you've provided in your writing efforts. And I think it's absolutely overwhelming to me. Women have more opportunities today maybe than they did during the greatest generation, but to bring these stories to light and to show little girls today, to show younger women that even in the most trying of circumstances, many of which we experience right now, you can be brave, you can make a difference. There is an opportunity to really change things. And you have brought to light these unsung heroines. And World War II, the historians say, was very pivotal because women were pretty much homemakers at that point, and over 350,000 women were employed by the US military during World War II. And a lot of them were on the home front, Rosie the Riveter, working in factories, but a lot of them were the women that you have written about, the flyers, the parachuters, the spies, and it really did, they say, change. It opened up other opportunities in other worlds to women. World War
And
II
they
did.
helped win the war.
And they helped win the war. And it's, once again, it's important that women get their, their due for all they have contributed and all they've done. And I just find these stories, even though they were years ago, a different time, a different age, I find them engaging, I find them motivating and inspirational. They're emotional, and it's all good. It's all such good stuff. And I wish we had another 3 hours to talk about all of this.
We could go on.
But
right?
I know, we really could. But I want to give, there are some questions, and I want to give you an opportunity. Okay, so one of them is, this is for Kristin. How involved were you in writing the screenplay for the adaptation of Nightingale? And how do you feel about the way the finished screenplay handles? Okay, well, that answers that question. So,
Got covers 0.
yeah, okay. So,
I'm well aware of what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. What I did do was read each version of the script and give notes. And I will say, as a small aside for people that are interested, the most difficult aspect for screenwriters to get right was the character of Vion, because motherhood is quiet and her story was quiet and her courage was quiet. And so it took a while to get that one right. So all I did, which is my favorite thing to do in the world, is tell people when they're wrong. So that's
You could be an editor too,
I love it. That's great. So another question, have any of you had any sort of negative reactions or feedback based on your writing from people who lived in that period that, oh, you got that all wrong, it wasn't like that?
I got just the opposite.
Yeah.
It was, when I was on book tour, I was in a store in Ohio that I went to often in Columbus, and an indie bookstore. And the gal there that ran their events grew up during World War II in London. And I think I could have busted my buttons because she was talking when she went to introduce me about how she remembered everything that I was talking about and how I got it so right. And I almost wanted to cry. It was so good. And then in the audience, it was a night for cocktails, let me tell you. And the audience that night was a pilot who wanted to congratulate me on getting the flying right, which is really hard. And I had a good friend of Kristin's read everything for me, but you really have to just put yourself in there and, you've got to be in that plane. I was like, it's flying, but I had to be 30 years earlier. So.
Well, it's interesting that that you are there. That's the big skill, that you are putting the reader right where
there
you are. And the one nice thing that happened to me, I haven't had any, you got it wrong yet, but I I don't know, a lot of us feel that only women read our books. And in this book, I've had so many wonderful reactions and even reviews, which I don't read them. I get so scared. But my husband, who's been reading them, said, you know, there are a lot of men who are really liking this book, you know. And to me, that was the biggest compliment, that I wanted to write novels. You know, I wasn't writing for, I wanted to write for readers.
Mhm,
And it made me feel really good that maybe I'm getting there, you know,
mhm.
that I'm writing for readers, and it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman.
One of the things also I think that we have to remember is that not everyone experienced the things the same way. You
Right.
know, if you've got 100,000, 120,000 people who were in internment camps, they're all individuals. They will all have experienced it
Mhm.
differently.
Right.
And so what we can do is do our best guess as to how our character would have experienced it based on the research we've done.
And you can't please everybody for sure.
Someone else asked, why do you think, whoops, I'm sorry. Why do you think, okay, why, I'm sorry about that. Why do you think the World War II era has become such a hot historical fiction genre?
Tell us, Kristen.
Yeah, I asked Kristen, I was too early.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good versus evil, big stakes. I mean, you know, to me, that's the answer. There are very few times in history where you have stakes as high as World War II and good versus evil as clearly defined, and injustice as epic as it was. And so you put all these players on all those big issues on the board, and what you can tell are remarkable stories. And what all of our research is based on are the factual, remarkable stories of the people who stood up against evil and against injustice at incredible personal risk.
Mhm.
And I think Jill hit on it. To me, it's the greatest generation. I mean, that's actually a big part of why I wrote The Four Winds too. I mean, I think this idea of understanding and realizing the strength and resilience and the power of the greatest generation, and World War II is a big part of what formed that generation.
Yeah,
Well,
great.
so, you know, the sense that I mean, so much suffering and misery and terror went down, and people really many people rose. I mean, when you think the Blitz, 57 straight nights of bombing London, you know, living in the tube station, and, you know, people coming out and their whole blocks were gone, you know, that they were able to rise up. And I think, you know, in our whole will you wear a mask crisis, it just amazes me to think of what that generation was faced with and what they rose to combat it and to survive it. And it's a big stage. It's not a piddly little.
You know, it's interesting though, because one of the things that was fascinating about World War II, which if any of you are around my age, your parents were involved in World War II, they ran out as soon as Pearl Harbor, and they volunteered, and many volunteered prior to that, going up to Canada and other places, which was very different from our experience in the 60s with Vietnam. But then you had the Twin Towers going down, and the number of people who enlisted and wanted to do something and wanted to help the country. So it is cyclical, like they say about history. You know, you do have this need to, I think, set your own needs aside and do something for the good of the world.
Mm.
Common good.
We are in the midst of the defining moment of our generation right now.
Right now,
And,
exactly. Are we
and
going to meet this moment? Are we going to rise up
Yeah.
and stop 250,000 people dying and 1,500 dying every day? I agree. We're in the same kind of moment.
This is
It's
the
a
moment.
choice. We all are now at a point where we have to make a choice. Do we look away? Do we go on about our business? Everything here is fine. My grandkids are fine, you know, but that was what my whole purpose in writing this book was, that it's you choose, you look away, but the evil is still there. So so we can't look away from what's real.
And, you know, an interesting point, when Ciji brought up the Blitz, if it was not for Great Britain, if it was not for England and the pilots, we would have had a hard time in World War II, because the plan that was set was the Japanese were going east and
Right.
go all the way to the east, and the Germans were going east this way, so that they would west, and then these would go east.
Mhm.
And then they would meet, and that was to take over the world. And the whole plans were laid out. And one of the things that stopped it were the RAF pilots in Great Britain. And
Right. And so that's when Hitler decided, oh, I think I'll go to Russia instead. And he was a fatal mistake.
yeah, I mean, it was
He never
very
invaded
interesting.
England, you know. Yeah.
Well, there's some other questions that I think I will answer. One of them was when Kim's book is going to be published, and I know you're still working on a publisher, right?
We're working
Is that
on it,
correct?
but it's
Okay.
at Kristin
Yeah.
already.
Yeah.
It's
And
now
another question was, you said that these were untold stories, and if they had been told, if there'd been a lot written, would you have not written your book? And I think you sort of answered that as well, is that there's always a different story. I mean, so many books have been written about the Jewish experience in World War II and the concentration camps and there, you know, there can't be too many stories. I
Well,
mean,
you know,
and there's a different personal perspective.
well, that's it. An editor said to me one time, I was writing a nonfiction book about joint custody of children, parents who'd worked out, you know, not tearing themselves apart. And there was another book I found out that was already coming out, and I was just, I wanted to quit. And this editor said, well, wait a minute. Nobody can write the book that Ciji's going to write.
Very
or
good.
Kim's going to write, you know, and that changed my life. And I never feared, you know, about, well, someone's going to write the same story, you know, no.
In fact,
Yeah.
you could give all four of us a single event and tell us to write about it, and every single one of them would be like night and day.
Oh, I like that idea. What a good exercise. Well, I want to thank all of our guests who joined us, and I want to thank our authors. You guys are absolutely awesome. I do wish we had hours more to do this. You've all contributed so much, and Kim, we're so looking forward to your new novel. All of our authors have been kind enough to share with me. Someone asked about what should my daughters be reading, and they all have books that they recommend based on the research they've done and what they're reading now. And everyone's going to get that list from me in an email, which also includes a copy, a video of this. We've recorded everything, so you'll get a video of this. You'll get all the information you need about buying their books, which of course we have at our store, except for Jill's. They had to reprint, and so they're not coming in until early December. But
No, probably closer to late December, I think.
oh, okay. Now it's late
Early
December.
It might be. It might, if they come in early, I'll make sure you get some.
Yeah, it is available on ebook, Kindle, etc. But you have to read it. It's very good. And if anybody would like their book autographed and personalized, we can make that happen as well. We have The Nightingale and we have Landing by Moonlight in the store. Kristin is kind enough to make some a limited number of copies of The Four Winds available to us with her signature.
Oh, sorry. The Nightingale. I don't have Four Winds.
Oh, no, when it comes out. No, when it comes out. No,
Oh,
when it comes out. No, we're taking pre-orders for the Four
okay.
Winds. We're taking pre-orders for
What's the update?
Okay.
we're taking pre-orders for Four Winds, and it is a gut-wrenching, it's a wonderfully gut-wrenching story. I don't know if you can say that or not, but it's really amazing. Anyway, we do have their current books, and we're happy to make those available to you, and we can get them signed and autographed in a limited number. Kristin can send us book plates. She is all the way up outside Seattle. But I just want to thank you ladies for joining us. This has been so delightful. And I don't even know. I'm so grateful for all of you for being
Cheryl,
with
thank
us.
you for getting those
And
fans
well,
back together
It
here,
was
too.
fun.
Well,
We got to get
thank
together
you.
again because we haven't been,
We were
around.
really well behaved.
So
You're getting a lot of trouble.
You're such
that,
old,
but that,
old friend. It's friends. It's really nice to get
yeah.
to see each other again. So thank
Well,
you, Cheryl.
thank you. It's what makes it very special. So thanks everyone for joining us, and be sure you read these books. They're outstanding. And until we meet again, I'm Cheryl
Yes.
Pop.
Thank you,
and
Cheryl.
I'm
Thank
signing
you,
off.
Cheryl, so
from
much.
Sauce in
It
the
was
Books by the
great
Bay.
fun and great to
Thank
see
you.
everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take
Goodbye.
care. Stay healthy.
Yeah.
Thank you.